Some photographers actually say it's best to overexpose your pictures to get the most quality out of them. What do I think? I'll tell you all about it on today's episode of
Ask David Bergman.
Hey everybody, welcome back. Here I am, as always, answering your photography questions right here on Adorama TV. Don't forget to go to AskDavidBergman.com. As always, ask your own photo questions there. I just might answer it on a future show. I'm also doing one-on-one workshops, so you can check that out on there as well. Also, you're here on the Adorama YouTube channel. I hope you're a subscriber. If not, go ahead and hit that button down below. Subscribe. Also, click the little bell so you get notifications as soon as new videos come out all week long, every single week. So let's get right down to today's show. I've got a question sent in by Brad M, and he simply asked, how do you properly ETTR? ETTR, if you haven't heard of that acronym, what it stands for is exposed to the right. And what it refers to is the histogram of your image. What the histogram is, you might have seen on the back of your camera or in your computer, that little graph that maybe you know what that is, maybe you don't, but I'll put a link to a video I did about the histogram and what it is. But simply put, it's a graph of the brightness of the pixels in your photograph, and it can be really helpful. Let's take a quick look just so we're all on the same page here. I'm going to go and capture one, and this is a picture of Sammy I did earlier this summer. And up here in the top left, that is the histogram. Let's zoom in here so you can really take a look and see what that looks like. And what that is it's a graph from the very bottom is pure black, 100, basically 0 all the way to 100 at the other end, which is pure white. It's technically 0 to 255, but if we just go by percentage, it's 0 to 100. So, and that actually shows us how much of the tones are in that. In this case, I have it set to RGB, so it's showing me the different channels, but you could also have it just set for brightness. And what I like about Capture One, one of the many things, is when I roll over the image here while I have my histogram up, it'll show me where that tone is in the histogram. So for example, when I'm here on the very dark areas in the background, you can see that that is the low end where that orange line is. That is the low end of the frame. Now, if we zoom out a little bit here and I go into her teeth, which are obviously nice, bright, and white, and I roll over that area, you can see that's all the way up near the top of the image. If I get into just the part where the little specular highlight is, the reflection of the light source, you can see that's all the way up near the top of the frame. So that is what the histogram is. Now, ETTR, the concept of ETTR is based on the fact that our cameras capture data in a linear way. It's a tone curve that's linear. I don't want to go down this rabbit hole of gamma corrections and linear data and all that kind of stuff. But suffice to say, the simplest way I can put it, and the way I like to think of it, is light to the camera is food, right? It's data, it's energy, right? It needs data, it needs light to be able to crunch those images. So the more light that's captured in each one of those photo sites, each one of those pixels on the sensor, each one of those wants to get as much data as it can. So that's more data. The more light, the more data. And think of it this way. If you took a picture of me in a dark room, completely pitch black, there's no data there, right? There's really nothing. If we tried to lighten that up in post, the camera or the computer wouldn't have any data to work with. Whereas if we made a properly exposed image, we could lighten it or darken it a little bit without really much problem because there's plenty of data there for the computer to work on. So that leads to the thought that there's always going to be more data on the right, on the brighter areas of that histogram. There's going to be more data. And the fact that it is linear means there is a lot more data on the right. So it's exponential how much more data there is as we get further up into the brighter areas. So what happens is in the darker areas, if you try to lighten up the dark areas where there's no data, it's going to bring in a lot of noise. The signal-to-noise ratio is much better where there's more light at the top than in the darker areas, because when those have to be lightened up, it's going to get really, really noisy. So cameras today, they have gotten much better in the shadows with the noise in the shadows, but you can still get things like banding because there's less gradation between tonal values. So if you were shooting something like a sunset, even properly exposed, I've seen properly exposed sunset images where The banding happens when you go from the really bright area of the sun to the darker areas around it. And if there's not enough data in there, if you just don't have all that meat for the camera to work on, you're going to see like lines of banding, even if it's properly exposed. So now ETTR, exposing to the right, would actually help that issue, but you don't want to go too far because then you'll blow it out and you won't be recoverable at all. So the thought process is exactly that. You want to capture more data and then darken it in post. I've heard people talk about ETTL, not the kind, the through the lens flash metering, but exposed to the left. That's the opposite. That's underexposing and then pulling up the shadows. I'm not a big fan of that. Some people would argue that it's a good way to go to get the nice sort of deep colors and in the dark areas and really get good blacks in the dark areas. I don't like that because if you ever have to lighten that up at all, you're going to just bring in too many issues, too much noise. So a couple things to be aware of. First of all, the histogram, when you're looking at it, especially on the camera, it's only a map of the JPEG, not the RAW file. So it's not completely accurate because the RAW file actually captures more data that's outside the dynamic range of a JPEG. There is a JPEG, even if you're shooting RAW only, there's an embedded JPEG because that's what you're looking at on the back of the camera as a JPEG image. But the RAW file actually captures more than that on both ends. There's a little bit more dynamic range at the top and the bottom. That is all recoverable in post if you're shooting RAW. The histogram also is affected by settings you might have set in the camera, like picture styles and things like that. So that will affect what the histogram looks like, but the RAW file is not affected by that. So if you wanted to get a better idea of what the RAW histogram looks like when you're shooting, you could set some picture style things where you lower the contrast, you can turn off sharpening and a bunch of other things like that to get a little bit more of an accurate look at the dynamic range. But then realistically, when you're out shooting, the image just isn't going to look very good and it's a little harder to judge what you're shooting. So, you know, I wouldn't recommend it necessarily, but it is one way to go if you really want to try to get a more accurate histogram. So back to ETTR, the idea there is to overexpose just enough to maximize the data captured. You want to capture as much data as possible, but not go too high that you blow out the highlights, even with the RAW, because you're still only going to get a couple of stops extra at the top. And if you go too far over that, you're going to be beyond anything that you can recover. Let's go back in the computer here. I'm going to show you, this is a video I took when I went outside a couple days ago in Central Park, and it's a video of me shooting stills, you know, through the EOS R, and basically you can see the live histogram as I'm shooting. I started here, I'm at f9 at ISO 100. That's the sweet spot of my lens. So this was the, what was I shooting? 16 to 35 f4. So I'm at f9. Base ISO 100, and I'm started at 2500th of a second, so it's obviously way underexposed. And then as I dialed down, as I slowed down my shutter speed, you can see obviously the image is getting brighter, but also that histogram is starting to slide from the left, when it was underexposed, more to the right, where it's overexposed. So that really gives you a good idea of how that histogram works. And then if we actually go look at the images, we can come in here. This is the image at 400th of a second, right? That was, and it's you know, exposed pretty properly. The sky looks good. The buildings maybe are a little under, but that's about where I'd want to be. This one is at 100th of a second. You can see obviously it's 2 stops brighter. So the sky is a little bit blown out. We lose some of that blue. The building looks a little bit better. But basically the concept of ETTR is because I've overexposed, now I can lower this exposure 2 stops and then still have basically the same image, right? These 2 images now are pretty much exactly the same. The clouds have moved a little bit, but other than that, it's the same. But here's the difference. If you were to zoom in way, way more than you ever would in real life, so you can see how that looks right there on this image. And then if we go to the other image, you can see it there as well. Now let's lighten it up so we can actually see it. I realize this kind of undoes what we wanted to do in the image, but I just want to show you as far as the noise that's in there. When we lighten them both up, we can see that this image, you can see the detail in there versus that one. This one is just a bit smoother. It's a little hard to see, especially probably on YouTube, but this one is just a bit smoother, whereas this one, it's got a bit more noise. It's a bit more jaggy. It just doesn't look quite as good. Now, we're zoomed in really far, but this shows you what the difference is, and you're going to have some areas that are, especially darker areas than this, that are going to have more of a difference. So, who would use this, right? So I don't shoot like this very often. Who would use this? Well, really, it's great for landscape photographers. Generally, you're going to be on a tripod and you're going to have the time to work with this and really, play around with different exposures. I would also bracket just for safety, right? So you've got different options. Somebody who wants to pull out the highest quality possible, especially if you're going to make giant, large prints. If you're a fine art photographer and you're going to make humongous prints that people are really going to get up close to, this is going to be a very good technique to pull every last bit of quality out if you can. Also, I think if you're shooting for HDR, where you're going to combine, make multiple raw conversions, especially if you're shooting one image and you're going to make multiple raw conversions, I would overexpose a bit, so that you have the highest quality in the shadows, but you still have enough that you can bring down your highlights and have a good usable image. Now, who wouldn't use this? Who is this not for? Well, anybody shooting something that's only going to happen once, you don't want to chance it, right? A wedding photographer, journalists, sports, even concert photographers. This is really best if you have time. You don't want to chance it with something that's not going to happen again, because if you overexpose too much, for example, a wedding photographer, and you blow out the dress, you don't have any detail on the dress because you've overexposed it too much, you're going to lose images, and that's not a good thing. So a couple of notes about this technique. Of course, you have to be either shooting manual exposure or you have to adjust your exposure. If you're using an auto mode, use exposure compensation to overexpose one or two stops. It obviously depends on what's in the image, but you have to sort of look at your histogram and make sure you're not going too far. It works best if you're shooting at your base ISO, the camera's base ISO. That's not always the lowest ISO, but for your camera, whatever the base ISO is. Otherwise, once you push up the ISO, you're adding extra noise, which the whole point is to keep noise as low as possible. So you're adding extra noise and then lowering the exposure. It kind of defeats the whole purpose. It's better to shoot at, let's say, 1600 ISO than to shoot at 3200 and darken it in post, right? So just shoot at 1600. If you have to shoot something where you need a fast shutter speed like that, again, this is not really for that kind of photography, so it's usually not going to be an issue. Also, obviously, you have to be shooting raw. You're going to be post-processing these images. If you don't plan on doing any post, there's absolutely no need to do ETTR, and you're not going to be able to recover anything from the JPEG anyway. My personal opinion, ETTR, I think it's overrated. Like I said, I think there are unique situations where it could be a tiny bit, 1, 2, 3, 5% helpful to just pull out a little bit of extra quality. But I'll show you one more thing. Let's close the computer. Those two images that I shot in Central Park, I made prints of them, right? I used my Canon Pro 1000, spit out a couple of prints. These two images, you obviously can't see on YouTube, but I've looked at these. These are 11 by 14, pretty good size prints. I've looked at these as close as possible, and I can't tell the difference between the two. I made a little dot on one of them just so that I know which is which. Otherwise, I would have had no idea which one of these is overexposed 2 stops and darkened in post, and which one was shot without any adjustments. So for an 11 by 14, that's a pretty big print. Now, I did also make 2 more prints. What I did was I took the image as big as I possibly could, and I cropped out an 11 by 14 piece of it. So this is about as big as this print would ever go. It's a portion of a giant print, so it's blown up as much as possible. On these prints, honestly, when I look really, really close, maybe I can see a tiny bit of difference, right? So again, if you're a fine art photographer and you're making a print for a 20-foot wall and you really want every possible bit of quality, go for it. Knock yourself out. For the rest of us, for most of us, ETTR, I think it's overrated. I don't think it's worth the extra effort. It adds a lot of work, to your workflow, because you need to actually work on every image in post. Also, when you're out shooting, as I said, you can't see the results in the field as you're working on it. It's really only useful if you have the time, you have plenty of light, and you're going to be printing very, very big. Me personally, I'm not a pixel peeper. I'm a working pro. I care much more about what's in front of the camera than the actual, pixel quality, right? I know these cameras already have amazing quality as it is, so I'm not really worried about the quality at all. It is important, of course, to understand how the tools work. You want to maximize image quality whenever possible. There's no reason not to do that. But if you get the exposure right in the camera, in most cases, you're going to be just fine. So that's my thoughts on ETTR. Thanks, Brad. I hope that answers your question. Remember, go to AskDavidBergman.com. Ask your own photo questions there. Down below, go ahead and subscribe, like, and comment so we can keep the dialogue going. And then, of course, here I am every Monday, 10 a.m. Eastern. There's a new episode of this show. I hope you'll come back and join me every week. I'll see you back here next time on Ask David Bergman.